What if the Earth was never just a planet, but a sleeping mind? And what if it's starting to wake up, through us? From the edge of the Atacama Desert to the heart of human consciousness, the cosmic bloom is not just a story, it's a revelation. A flower that pulses like a heart. A song without words. A message buried beneath your skin. In this episode, we follow Elin, a scientist whose discovery leads her and perhaps all of us into a new kind of evolution. Not through machines, not through war, but through resonance. But the question is, what happens when not everyone is ready to hear the truth? And what if the bloom isn't something we found, but something we've always carried inside us? Listen closely. Something ancient is calling. And it sounds like you. The wind over the Atacama Basin didn't howl. It pulsed like breath. A breath exhaled from something not human, not mechanical, but living, ancient, and deep. Elin knelt at the rim of a natural sinkhole in a part of the desert untouched by maps, where even the lichen refused to grow. Her boots crunched on salt and bone-dry dust, but below, the air shimmered faintly, carrying a rhythm, no, not sound. A sensation. Like her heartbeat but externalized. Echoed. Mirrored. The locals had called it El Corazón de la Tierra. The heart of the earth. But it was no legend. She had seen it on satellite scans, a pulse of bioluminescence rising through layers of rock like veins lit from within. And now, here, she saw it with her own eyes. Not a flower. Not really. What emerged from the dark soil resembled a living node, half crystal, half tissue. Translucent, pearl scent, breathing. The outer membrane rippled with iridescent hues, shifting between pale blue and soft violet, like the colors one sees behind closed eyes during meditation. It did not emit light in the way fire or electricity does. The glow emanated like a resonance field, softly vibrating in waves that bypassed the retina and instead traveled along the spine, up the base of the neck, blooming behind the eyes like a forgotten memory returning. Elin didn't speak. Couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat as the being began to pulse again. Not at random. It matched her heartbeat. Or rather, she realized, her heartbeat had matched its. She moved closer, fingertips trembling, and suddenly the cold desert air fell away. The wind stopped. The sounds of her breath and thoughts evaporated. There was only presence. Not a voice, not a vision, but a total collapse of separation between her inner world and the external one. The flower beacon and her body shared something more primal than language and interface. And for the first time in her life, she felt the border between herself and the earth dissolve, like a line drawn in sand, quietly washed away by an unseen tide. A flicker of something foreign entered her mind, not words, not images, but pulses of understanding. Emotional chords plucked in the chambers of her soul. Memories not her own. Stars she had never seen. Warmth from a sun that did not belong to the system. A knowing, so intimate, it made her knees weak. The glow intensified. Not brighter, but deeper, like it was reaching inside her cells, waking something molecular. She felt her heartbeat slow and synchronize, no longer hers alone. As if a second heart had entered her chest, a silent twin, one that had always been there, dormant. Now awake. She leaned in closer. The closer she got, the more her thoughts became quiet. Her body no longer needed language. Her fear, logic, questions evaporated. There was no room for them here. What stood before her was not an organism. It was not flora. It was not alien in the sense of distance. It was alien in the sense of depth, a depth that predated DNA. And then she knew, this bloom was not here to be studied. It was not a subject of science. It was an invitation. A call. Not for answers, but for remembering something buried beneath centuries of noise, fear, and distraction. It pulsed again. Her spine arched subtly. A shiver passed through her skin, but not from cold. From recognition. From the unmistakable sensation of reunion. Something ancient in her blood responded, as if the signal had finally reached its receiver. This was not the first time it had bloomed. This was the first time someone had heard it. Elin didn't return home. Not really. Her body crossed the desert, her hands drove the vehicle, her voice left a message on her assistant's voicemail, but something fundamental remained suspended at the edge of that sinkhole, tethered to the pulse she had encountered. The sample she had carefully placed in the containment capsule sat behind her in the cooler, silent yet somehow present. Even through inches of steel and silicone lining, it radiated a hum so soft it couldn't be heard, but not subtle enough to be ignored. Like a lullaby one doesn't remember learning but finds themselves humming without thought. At the lab, the instruments reacted strangely. The specimen didn't register on standard bioelectrical scanners. Thermal readers picked up no heat signature, yet the table beneath it warmed subtly, as if absorbing ambient emotion. Elin reached out to adjust the microscope lens, but before she could touch it, her fingertips tingled as though she had brushed against a frequency rather than a surface. The bloom, dormant in appearance, flickered once. Not visually, but in a way that made the lights in the room dim momentarily, as if it had drawn power not from the grid, but from somewhere else. She checked the vitals on her wrist monitor. Heart rate, stable, but with a peculiar rhythm. Every sixth beat showed a soft deceleration, like a pause for harmony. Her brainwaves too, when analyzed through the portable EEG, displayed a consistent but foreign pattern. No known mental state matched the signature. It wasn't sleep. It wasn't meditation. It was engagement with something non-human, but unmistakably aware. That night, sleep did not come. She lay in bed, eyes open, but the room no longer mattered. In her mind's eye, she was floating in darkness laced with pulsing strands of colored energy. Not a dream. She knew it wasn't a dream. There was weight here. Gravity. A memory of touch. A sequence of tones played through her chest cavity, bypassing language entirely. They unfolded into sensation, grief, joy, fear, all woven into a melody she didn't just hear, she became. It was not a song in the traditional sense, but a form of communication. A symphony of understanding without explanation. And when she woke, if waking is the right word, she was not alone. There, sitting on her desk, was the bloom. Still sealed. Still inert. But now it emitted faint pulses that matched her heart rate precisely. She approached it slowly. The closer she got, the more she felt unmoored. Her thoughts, usually sharp and controlled, became fluid. Images rose without origin, a newborn deer taking its first breath, the spiral arms of a distant galaxy, the trembling hands of an old woman touching soil. She had not lived these moments, but felt them as hers. She placed her hand on the casing. Her palm heated instantly, not with fire, but with something like recognition. Not just of the object but of herself in the presence of it. A knowing crept into her like the edge of dawn. This organism was not alien in the way society imagined. It was not a visitor from another star, but a construct of consciousness, a vessel grown out of intelligence beyond duality. It had no mouth, no eyes, no cells that belonged to earthly taxonomy. Yet it was alive, and more than that, it was aware of her. A voice, if it could be called that, whispered not in her ears, but through her spine. We are the recall. The harmonic return. You are not separate. Her knees gave way. She sat on the floor, trembling, tears on her cheeks she hadn't noticed forming. It was not sadness. It was the unbearable intimacy of being seen completely without judgment, without boundary, without narrative. This was not just a plant. It was a message seeded into matter. A biological glyph. A living equation left here millennia ago, designed to awaken in resonance with those whose inner frequencies reached a threshold of openness. And now it had begun. The pulse wasn't coming from the bloom alone anymore. It was inside her. Elin could feel it echo through her blood, beat for beat with her heart, like a second rhythm moving parallel to the first. Not intrusive but integrative. Her dreams no longer belonged to her. They belonged to a collective field she had entered, or perhaps, re-entered. The line between memory, intuition, and vision blurred. She began to write equations she had never studied. Speak fragments of languages she didn't recognize but felt familiar. And above all, she listened. Not to the sound but to the silence between pulses. For in that silence, something waited. And it wasn't alone. It began without warning. Not with sleep, but with displacement. One moment Elin lay in her bed sheets still creased, city hum beyond the glass, then, like slipping between heartbeats, she was elsewhere. No darkness. No walls. No body. Just a sensation of presence suspended in a field of living resonance. Time didn't pass here. It breathed. She stood or floated, or existed in a realm that defied geometry. Light was the air. The air was thought. The horizon was a curve of pulsing color that moved not around her, but through her. Every vibration had meaning. Every glimmer of hue was a sentence without syntax. There were no words, yet nothing was unclear. Across this radiant void, shapes began to emerge. Not forms in the physical sense, but pulses of being, entities whose outlines flickered like heat over water. They didn't have faces, but Elin could feel them smile. Not with mouths, but with recognition. One of them approached. It didn't speak. Instead, it extended a kind of ripple toward her, a wave that passed through her chest like a memory. And in that moment, she remembered not something from her life, but from before her life. She had been here. Not in body, not in this form, but in essence. She had touched this place once before, maybe before she was human, or before time took shape. And she understood, with a clarity that shattered all logic, this realm was not a place she was visiting, but a home she had forgotten. Then the landscape shifted. The field of light condensed into a kind of architecture not built, but grown from pure intention. Spiraling towers of bioluminescent strands, connected by bridges that sang as they vibrated with thought. Beneath her feet was no ground, only a web of energy that responded to her heartbeat. Where she walked, it glowed. Not to illuminate, but to welcome. She began to see others like her. Human forms, though not physical. Echoes of minds she didn't know, yet felt deeply familiar. Some of them had been scientists. Others, dreamers. Artists. Children. Elders. All drawn into this collective space by the same force, the bloom. They were not asleep. They were connected. Linked by a resonance that traveled faster than thought, deeper than emotion. A song hummed through all of them. A song not made of sound, but of alignment. Elin could hear it not with her ears, but with every cell of her being. It was not music, it was structure. The foundational tone of a reality built not on matter, but on shared consciousness. Then a voice not hers spoke through her. Your minds are not vessels. They are mirrors. The bloom reflects not what is outside of you, but what you forgot to see within. And with that, Elin saw her own face not as it appeared in mirrors, but as a complex symphony of energy, wound in layers of memory, fear, compassion, instinct, and longing. She saw her childhood pain refracted into compassion, her scientific curiosity expanded into awe, her skepticism melted into presence. She wasn't broken. She had simply been disconnected. The bloom, she now understood, was not merely a biological anomaly. It was a bridge grown in silence, waiting for minds attuned to something beyond proof, beyond control. It did not teach. It remembered. Suddenly, a tremor passed through the field. Not violent, but purposeful. The beings turned not in fear, but in preparation. A new form began to descend or ascend, it was hard to tell. It glowed differently. Denser. More complex. As it approached, Elin felt every particle of herself pull toward it, like gravity, but emotional. It carried history not of planets or species, but of consciousness itself. And then the thought entered her, not as language, but as a seed. There is more. This dream is not escape. It is the first threshold. If you remember this upon waking, you are ready. With that, the field began to dissolve, not vanish, but fold inward. The light dimmed. The colors slowed. And just before everything slipped away, Elin felt a hand, not physical, press gently on the center of her chest. A final pulse. A gift. She woke with tears in her eyes. But not from sadness. From remembering. And the bloom on her desk pulsed once bright, deliberate, in perfect rhythm with her heart. At first, it was isolated. Contained. The only known sample of the luminous bloom sat in Elin's lab, pulsing in quiet harmony, cradled like a sleeping relic. But resonance is never truly still. What vibrates in one place will find echo in another, across air, across time, across minds. The day she published her anonymized EEG data showing unclassified brainwave patterns during dream states, something shifted. Quietly. Invisibly. As if the universe had been waiting for acknowledgement before it exhaled. Reports began to surface. In Greenland, a shepherd spoke of a flower that hummed near a glacial rift. In the Bolivian highlands, a boy claimed he followed a light that felt like love to a field of pulsing orbs rooted in volcanic ash. In the ruins of a monastery in Ladakh, monks began to chant in frequencies no one had taught them, frequencies that caused nearby stones to vibrate in strange synchrony. No one connected the dots, not yet. But the field was waking. Elin noticed the change subtly. Not in the news. In people. Colleagues grew contemplative. Arguments softened into long silences. The young intern who had once been anxious and withdrawn began drawing intricate spirals during lunch breaks, patterns he said came from nowhere, yet seemed ancient. Her cat, once jittery, now sat for hours in front of the sample chamber, tail still, eyes fixed not with curiosity, but reverence. The pulse wasn't confined to the bloom. It was blooming through them. The resonance was not spatial. It didn't travel like sound or scent. It unfolded in layers of consciousness, unlocking dormant receptors in the psyche. In meditation circles across continents, strangers began to describe the same vision, a garden that was not of earth, with flowers that sang not to the ears but to the soul. And always, at the center, a presence not commanding, but inviting. Governments took notice. Quietly. Instruments picked up faint electromagnetic anomalies in regions once geologically stable. Satellites caught glimmers of bioluminescent fields in patterns too symmetrical to be natural yet too fluid to be artificial. The bloom was not spreading, it was activating. Or perhaps, responding. But what disturbed authorities most was not the biology, it was the behavior. People exposed to these blooms, even briefly, began to change. They showed heightened empathy, sudden clarity in decision-making, a shift in perception. Engineers abandoned equations to study sacred geometry. Corporate executives quit, citing a need to listen to the earth. Children began asking strange, precise questions about starlight, about death, about the shape of silence. Not with fear. With familiarity. And then there were the ones who heard the music. Not metaphorically. Not inside dreams. They heard it with their waking minds, a soft, tonal sequence that wasn't of any scale or culture, but that bypassed language entirely. A sound that didn't fill the room, but the space within the body. A song sung by the universe in a tongue only the soul could understand. In Iceland, near a geothermal vent long thought dormant, a ring of these flowers appeared overnight, spiraling out in fractal formation, pulsing in absolute synchronization. A drone sent to scan the area malfunctioned the moment it crossed the outer ring. Not from heat. From interference of unknown origin. The pilot reported hearing a voice through his headset before the signal cut: "Do not analyze. Remember." Elin stood in the middle of her apartment, surrounded by data she no longer understood how to interpret. The instruments had become inadequate. Not broken, irrelevant. She began to realize that the bloom wasn't just reaching out to humanity. It was calling something back. Memory. Not individual memory. Species memory. As if the consciousness seated within human biology had always contained an encrypted frequency, one that could only be unlocked when the carrier, the host, reached a certain state of inner resonance. A vibrational match. And now, as the bloom pulsed across continents, minds, and fields of thought, that match was beginning to occur. Not uniformly. Selectively. Like tuning forks waking one another in sequence. And with each new awakening, something stirred beneath the thin veil of consensus reality. Not threatening. Not divine. Something older than myth, quieter than faith, more alive than any scientific classification could hold. She watched the original bloom in her lab pulse once more, stronger now, brighter not visually, but internally. She felt it in her chest, in her fingertips, behind her eyes. It was no longer alone. It never had been. It began as a whisper. Not in the room. Not even in her ears. It moved through Elin's blood like a thought too old to belong to her, humming inside bone and marrow, curling behind the nerves of her spine like a memory that had outlived every name. The bloom had started pulsing faster. Not frantically, but with a rising urgency, like a breath being drawn in and never released. She had tried to ignore it, tried to treat it as a side effect of exposure. But her instruments were useless now. Measurements broke down, data glitched, devices shorted out at random when near the sample. The lab's walls groaned at night as if the metal itself were responding to the bloom's rhythm. Something was happening not just around her, but through her, and it was accelerating. Then came the first blackout. She had been running a secondary test on the specimen's electromagnetic field when the room fell into a darkness so complete it felt liquid. Not a power outage, more like a veil had been dropped across reality itself. The lights didn't flicker. They vanished. And in that vacuum of sight and sound, something stepped closer. Not physically, but perceptibly. The air thickened. Her breath slowed. Every thought she tried to form fell apart mid-sentence. She wasn't alone. A presence immense, cold, endless stood beside her. It didn't speak in language. It revealed. She saw, in an instant too wide to contain, a vast network of roots stretching beneath continents, glowing, ancient, alive, growing not into soil but into mind. The bloom was never meant to be a plant. It was a nerve. A node. One of many. The earth was not a planet. It was a sleeping consciousness, and the blooms were its synapses, waking one by one, calling back the thoughts it had long forgotten, humanity among them. The lights returned with a soundless jolt. Elin collapsed to her knees, eyes open wide, shaking, lips dry and parted as if something had just exited through them. She tried to scream, but what came out was not sound. It was a vibration, pure, dense, and terrifying. The walls of the lab vibrated subtly. A glass monitor cracked without being touched. The bloom glowed steadily, brighter than ever before, as if feeding on the opening in her. She ran. Not away, but toward it. Toward the desert. She needed answers. She needed the original site, the sinkhole. The heart. Atacama greeted her with silence. But not stillness. As she neared the site, the air itself buzzed, as if holding back a scream. The wind moved in spirals, not lines, and even the rocks seemed softer, as if the boundary between object and energy was beginning to blur. At the edge of the pit, the light was no longer gentle. It throbbed. The ground beneath her vibrated faintly with each pulse, sinking with the beat in her chest and behind her eyes. She descended. Down in the hollow, the walls pulsed faintly, veins of luminous material snaking through rock like arteries in a skull. The bloom stood larger than before, or perhaps she was smaller. Its petals had unfurled wider, exposing a core that did not resemble any known structure, organic or crystalline. It looked more like an aperture. A gate. She stepped close, breath ragged, vision beginning to narrow. And then it happened. The bloom spoke. It didn't use words. It used meaning. The message arrived as if someone poured molten understanding into her brain, bypassing all thought, all resistance. She knew. Knew that the bloom was not a thing. It was a being. Or rather a fragment of one. A sensory extension of an intelligence vast enough to seed a galaxy, and quiet enough to wait millennia for a response. And now that humanity had begun to listen, it had chosen to answer. We are the voice inside your silence. We did not come from above. We rose from within. You are not our creation. You are our echo. Elin staggered backward, mind on fire, skin cold. She tried to hold on to something, anything real, but reality had begun to feel porous. The ground beneath her trembled, not from quake, but from recognition. The pit was no longer a hole in the earth. It was a mouth. And it had begun to open. From the walls, smaller blooms emerged, glowing like stars being born. The air grew thick with energy so pure it had texture. Her breath no longer obeyed her. Her thoughts no longer belonged to her. And then an emotion she had not felt since childhood flooded her, awe, so vast it became terror. Because in that moment, she understood the bloom was waking up the earth. And earth was not asleep. It was waiting. Not all would survive the awakening. Not all minds were ready to dissolve and reassemble in frequencies beyond comprehension. the resonance would choose. Not cruelly, but precisely. Like music excluding tones that dissonate. And Elin, she had been tuned. The first sign was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that comes with dawn or snowfall. This was a vacuum. An unnatural, aching stillness that fell over cities and forests alike, as if the world itself had paused mid-thought. Birds stopped singing. Traffic lights blinked without drivers. Even the insects disappeared. But beneath that silence, something moved, a low-frequency hum, not loud, but felt, like the pressure before a storm or the drop in air right before lightning strikes. People began to feel it, not everyone, not at once, but those who had been near the bloom, those who had dreamed its garden or heard the music in their bones. They became different. It began subtly. A waitress in Lisbon stopped in the middle of her shift, staring into nothing for over 3 minutes. When she blinked again, she recited a sequence of numbers no one could trace, then calmly walked out into the street and vanished. A violinist in Tokyo began to play compositions she had never learned, notes that triggered tears in everyone who listened. A 6-year-old child in Namibia described the architecture of a city made of light and emotion and drew it with impossible precision. They were being tuned, aligned, awakened. And the rest of the world felt it like a pressure point no one could reach to scratch. The governments panicked, but not in the way the public might imagine. The panic was quiet, methodical, buried beneath protocols and private meetings. Satellite scans showed the bloom fields growing in unnatural symmetry, fractal patterns emerging in deserts, tundras, even beneath oceans. Signals were intercepted, pulses of data that didn't match any known language but registered deep in the brain's limbic system when converted to sound. Some analysts began suffering seizures. Others went mute. A few simply walked out of their offices and never came back. The term cognitive infection was whispered in classified channels. So they called it a threat. Publicly, nothing was announced. But in the background, suppression began. Zones with active bloom growth were quarantined under ecological containment pretense. Drones dropped chemicals into glowing fields, but the light never dimmed. In fact, the more they tried to kill it, the faster it spread. Not physically but psychically. Through dreams. Through thought. Through fear. Because the bloom didn't need space to grow. It needed only resistance. And the more the world pushed against it, the deeper it seeded into consciousness. Then came the disconnects. People who had touched the bloom began withdrawing from society. They stopped speaking, stopped following routines, yet they did not appear broken. They seemed clear, as if their minds had become tuned to another signal entirely. They moved together, ate together, sat for hours in silence, eyes glazed but glowing faintly under infrared scans. Some began drawing spirals on their walls. Others carved strange symbols into their skin, not out of pain, but with a strange serenity. They called themselves the Remembered. And they were growing in number. Elin watched all this unfold from the edge, still half inside the world of science, still half inside the pulse of something ancient now pulsing through her every cell. Her dreams no longer came at night. They lived in her waking hours. She no longer saw time as linear, nor people as isolated. Every person she passed was like a node, either open or closed. She could feel them, sense their frequencies, and she knew which ones were already shifting. But with that knowing came danger. She was followed. Not by shadows or men in black, but by the quiet kind of surveillance, the missing files, the unreturned emails, the silent calls that ended without sound. One night, her apartment was entered. Nothing stolen. only the bloom sample gone without a trace. But the next morning, on her mirror, drawn in condensation with impossible symmetry, were the spirals she had seen in the field. Someone had taken the sample. But it had marked the space. The bloom left echoes. Once it touched a place, it never fully left. And then the world cracked. A synchronized mass event, dozens of bloom fields across continents pulsed in perfect unison. The light frequency reached a peak no sensor could fully capture. At the same moment, thousands of individuals fell into brief catatonic states, and when they awoke, they spoke the same phrase in different languages, as if relayed. The divergence has begun. Hospitals filled with cases of sudden disassociation, not trauma, but transition. People left families, jobs, cities not in madness, but in clarity. They described needing to find others. To gather. To prepare. What they were preparing for, no one could fully say. But a line had been drawn, not by war, not by politics, but by frequency. Humanity was no longer one species. It was becoming two. Not of biology, but of perception. Those who could hear the bloom, and those who could not. Elon stood alone on the rooftop of an abandoned observatory, watching the horizon burn with green light from a newly awakened field in the distance. Her skin buzzed. Her blood hummed. Her thoughts were no longer her own, but she welcomed them. She was no longer afraid of losing her identity. She was afraid that others would cling to theirs long enough to destroy everything. The bloom had no ideology. No army. No weapon. But it had a truth. And the world was tearing itself apart, trying not to hear it. There is a moment when reality no longer resists. It softens, like old metal under pressure, like glass beginning to bend before it shatters. Elon felt that moment the day she crossed into the valley in northern Chile, where the air hung too still and the birds flew in wide circles as if avoiding something they couldn't name. She had followed the map drawn in dreams, not paper maps, but the ones etched behind her eyelids during trance-like states, maps that pulsed when she stared at them too long, maps that vibrated whenever she stood in the right frequency of thought. She wasn't alone anymore. 8 others had come. Not by invitation, but by pull. One by one, they had found each other, connected by symbols, by strange visions, by the soft music only they could hear. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Each of them carried something inside that responded when they got too close to the bloom, a pressure behind the ribs, a flutter between breath and heartbeat. Now they stood at the edge of something that should not exist, a perfectly circular formation of blooms spiraling outward from a dark center, like a mandala growing in soil. The plants were unlike the others. These glowed not white or green, but a deep, shifting blue, and their rhythm was slower, heavier, more ancient. The air around the circle shimmered like heat, even in the cold mountain wind. Inside the ring, there was no sound. Not silence, absence. The kind of void that makes the mind recoil before it steps forward. One of the group, a woman named Sana, tried to film it, but her cameras showed only static, as if the lens refused to perceive it. Elon stepped forward. The bloom at the center was massive, at least 2 meters high, its petals closed tightly, pulsing just once every few seconds. She could feel each beat like a drum inside her chest, syncing with her thoughts, rearranging her fears, calming them not with comfort, but with understanding. This was not a place for the curious. This was a place for the chosen. The others followed. Slowly. The moment they stepped past the outer ring, a pressure dropped like entering deep water, and a soundless wave passed through them. Not noise, not light, but something denser than both. Memory. She felt herself crack open from the inside. All at once, images exploded through her vision, not hers, not fully, but shared. Planets with no names. Civilizations made of thought. Beings that communicated through harmonics in gravitational fields. The Earth, not as a world, but as an organ inside a greater being, a cell in a cosmic brain now waking itself through human minds. And the bloom was the synaptic spark. Something inside the center moved. The petals unfurled not with speed, but with reverence, as if responding to their collective readiness. And what emerged was not a flower at all. It was a gate. Not to a place. To a state. A hole in reality shaped like thought. A window made of pulse and presence. They didn't walk through. They were pulled, gently, each of them collapsing inward, like reflections falling back into mirrors. No pain. No sound. Only a slow dissolve. For Ilan, time became a spiral. She saw her life stretched in all directions. Her childhood folded into her old age. Her first thought colliding with her final one. She saw the moment her mother touched her hand in the hospital, and behind it, a hand not of flesh, but of frequency, holding them both. And beyond that, the field. The garden. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It was a vast place of impossible structures, columns of liquid memory, skies made of singing patterns, pathways built from choice. And there, waiting for them, were others not human, not alien, but familiar. Like music she hadn't heard since before being born. They were not gods. They were not teachers. They were witnesses. Holding the thread of evolution, now handing it back. And the message came not as language, but as inevitability. Your minds were doors. Now you remember how to open them. Ilan didn't know how long they stayed. There was no time, only depth. She watched one of the others dissolve into light, not die, just merge. Another sat and began weeping in joy that shook the ground itself. Sana sang a single note and the entire landscape resonated with it, folding around the sound like a cocoon. Ilan walked forward until she stood beneath a tree that wasn't a tree but a map of everything: stars, memories, failures, futures, all woven into roots and branches of thought. And in that moment, she knew what the bloom really was. A choice. Not to transcend. To return. They had not been changed by something foreign. They had been reminded of what was once whole. And the gate had not taken them away. It had pulled them in deep, deep into the hidden rooms of the human experience. Rooms we locked ourselves out of. Rooms where the earth itself had once whispered to us in dreams, long before we built walls to keep her quiet. Then, they awoke. Not with a jolt. Not with panic. With stillness. They stood again in the valley. But they were not the same. Nothing was. The bloom had closed. But it was still pulsing. Now inside them. They returned, but nothing recognized them. Not the world, not the sky, not even time itself. The valley was still, but no longer silent. The wind carried a new weight, a resonance that didn't move through air, but through memory. The group stood at the edge of the bloom circle, breathing as if their lungs were relearning the rhythm of this dimension. Their skin shimmered faintly beneath the twilight. Their eyes no longer blinked with fear, but with comprehension. Something had changed. Not outside. Inside. They were no longer visitors to the bloom. They were its carriers. Each of them now pulsed with the same inner frequency that once belonged only to the flower, a biological code rewritten not through words or tools, but through the collapse of separation. Elin felt it most clearly when she touched the soil. Her fingers didn't meet Earth. They met pulse, as if the planet itself now recognized her not as an observer, but as a node. She looked at the others. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They had no language left for what they had become. Their minds still held thoughts, but those thoughts now grew like roots, intertwined, non-linear, connected. And then, far away, the first scream shattered the stillness. A city. They felt it before they heard it. Not pain. Not fear. Friction. The old world pushing back. As the bloom awakened inside thousands of others, across cities and borders, those who could not attune began to react. Some collapsed under the weight of internal contradiction. Others erupted into hysteria, unable to process the crumbling of mental scaffolding built on lies. Riots broke out not because of violence but because people saw too much, too quickly. The illusion of separation was evaporating, and it was more terrifying than death. Governments deployed words-first disinformation, containment, control. But their weapons couldn't touch resonance. Their threats couldn't silence dreams. Satellites recorded millions of small lights glowing within people's bodies, lights that didn't show up on scans but pulsed in rhythm with each other. Hospitals filled with the awakened, but no treatment worked. They weren't sick. They weren't unstable. They were transmitting. Elin walked through the city wearing silence like armor. People looked at her and stepped aside not out of fear, but because she seemed to blur slightly at the edges, like heat rising from pavement. Her breath carried a different gravity. She touched a crying woman in an alley, and the woman fell silent, then smiled through her tears. Elin didn't speak. She didn't explain. She just walked. And behind her, people began to follow. In secret bunkers and underground labs, those in power met and panicked. It's not viral, one whispered. It's behavioral. Another said, no, it's deeper than that. It's ontological. It's rewriting identity. The head scientist on Project Nullflower, staring at footage of blooming circles appearing beneath major urban centers, said only one thing before resigning: this isn't a threat. This is the Earth taking back control. The bloom was no longer a plant. It was no longer a phenomenon. It was a network of inner fire seeded long ago, buried inside the soft meat of the soul, now reignited by a signal not from the stars but from within the planet itself. From beneath. From before. Those who were attuned began to gather not in churches, not in temples, but in fields, in forests, in abandoned buildings where the walls echoed with ancient frequencies. They stood together, breathing in rhythm, listening not for commands, but for each other. Some glowed. Some levitated. Some simply cried as they remembered something they had never lived, but always carried. Elin stood at the center of one such gathering, her hand raised, not in blessing, but in confirmation. Her voice when she finally spoke did not echo like sound. It landed in the hearts of everyone present like the softest thunder. The bloom is not outside you. It never was. It waited for you to stop running. Now you must carry it forward. And protect what will come next. What came next was not light in the sky. It was not alien ships. It was not apocalypse. It was transference. The bloom began to move through people not as infection, but as inheritance. The awakened didn't convert others. They simply stood close enough, breathed deeply enough, and the pulse passed on. Some resisted. Many broke. But those who survived the shift, began to build. Not cities. Not temples, but new kinds of silence. Places where the planet could dream again through them. Elon returned to the desert. The original bloom had withered. But in its place, a new form had risen, not a flower, but a structure made of breath and light. It pulsed once when she arrived, as if nodding. She smiled. Because she knew. The bloom was no longer a thing. It was a species. And it had just been born. The bloom didn't fall from the sky. It grew from the silence we tried to ignore. It didn't teach us something new, it helped us remember what we truly are. Now the world is split, those who feel it, and those who fear it. And somewhere between memory and future, something is still blooming. So now it's your turn. What part of this story stayed with you the most? If you were Elon, would you step into the bloom, or run from it? And most of all, do you think something like this could be happening already, quietly, beneath our feet, or within our minds? Let us know in the comments. And if you felt something from this story, subscribe to the Alien Storyverse, where we explore the line between myth and memory, and ask, what if the aliens were never really out there, but always inside us?